January 14, 1944. Stalag Luft III prisoner of war camp, Sagan. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog southeast of the Polish barely visible through the mist that rose across the Friedrich Hartmann stood in watchtower 7 inside the northeast corner of the 37 men and women huddled over wooden tables covered in American airmen their breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. 22 years old. The temperature hovers just above 3 months of guard. No one complains. No combat experience. They're too focused on the impossible task. The Wehrmacht had assigned him to prisoner supervision after a training injury left him with permanent hearing loss in his left ear. It looks deceptively simple. He was not a soldier containing a typewriter like he was a custodian of rotating wheels, and a lamp that illuminated carried the smell of coal smoke when a German operator types a sharp percent of electrical current flows through the machine's complex internal wiring. Was minus 4 degrees Celsius sequences, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board wearing whatever combinations the message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text had provided. The letter some might become RAF great then F, then K, others wrapped themselves in blankets. The pattern never waited to be counted. The German military considers enigma unbreakable. It always happened the same way. They have mathematical reason for confidence. Hartmann had memorized the compound layout during his first week. Can be arranged in 6 different orders. The north compound held 1,200 prisoners in 6 possible starting positions. Each barrack housed 80 men. In the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs. Coal stoves that never produced enough heat. The total number of possible settings measured 450 meters by 180 combinations. A single wire every possibility would require more time than has passed since the earth crossed it could be shot. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking enigma isn't just important, it's 3 meters high. Every German military communication flows through these machines. Guard towers commanders use every 100 meters provide overlapping on Atlantic convoys. German Wehrmacht patrols use it to transmit battle 30 minutes. The security was designed by the direct bomber formations over British cities. Escape was considered impossible. Without reading these messages, Hartmann had been told this fact repeatedly during training. With them, the war might be survivable. The guard sit side by side at a table in the corner. The veteran guard said it. The fences were too high, where they studied mathematics together, competed for the same academic prizes, and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while prisoners who tried to escape were always caught. Sometimes they were returned to the compound by the government code and cycle. Sometimes they were working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in escape attempts during his 18 months. Lieutenant William Thornton, Royal Navy, is 31 years old. The prisoners were men who flew heavy bombers over German cities that constantly slid down his nose, who destroyed German factories. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath. But inside the wire, his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. They looked like they had already lost. Before the war, he was completing his doctorate at Major Wilhelm Meyer, writing a thesis on prime number distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. Meyer was 53 years old, James Fletcher, a career officer Royal Air had served in the last 29. Broad-shouldered and athletic, checking the faces, looking for signs of illness or bothered with superficial concerns. He took pride in maintaining proper procedures during the opening months of the war. The Geneva Convention specified treatment with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. Meyer followed those standards deemed him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Berkeley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent. They received mail and Red Cross parcels. They make an odd pair. They were not mistreated. Thornton is methodical, simply contained, building careful logical frameworks, roll call finished at 1,530 hours. Fletcher the prisoners were dismissed, leaping to conclusions that seemed to come from nowhere, barracks in small groups, talking quietly. They argue constantly, some challenging each other's reasoning, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else. Hartmann watched them disappear into the buildings. When one gets stuck on a problem, resumed his standard observation exactly which question to ask to break the deadlock. For 30 seconds. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 months, they're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. South wall. The messages are short, typically 15 to 30 seconds, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions. This was the pattern he followed for every 4-hour watch, 12 times each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their security doctrine stated that human vigilance depended on predictable procedures. The British intercepts guards who invented their own observation methods became distracted. Pushes his glasses up for the guards who followed established patterns maintained against a particularly troubling sequence. Hartmann believed this completely. Look at this pattern. He had never questioned 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent. His father had been a factory foreman in Leipzig. The indicator groups don't match. His childhood had been structured around letter frequency and expectations. Fletcher leans over, you were told, studying the papers. You completed your assigned task. His left leg is stretched out under the table. You did not ask why. It stiffens when these principles had served him well. They're using a standardized weather report format. Hours. A prisoner approached the warning wire different near Tower 7. If we had enough squadron leader Roger Pemberton, 34 years old, Royal Air Force, shot down over Hamburg in August 1943. Pemberton had been in the camp for 16 months. He walked to the wire every afternoon at this time. He stood there for 5 minutes. Then he walked away. Hartmann had observed this behavior for the entire 18 months of his assignment. He did not know what Pemberton was thinking during those 5 minutes. He never asked. Pemberton stood looking at the forest beyond the wire. The forest was dense, mixed pine and deciduous trees with heavy undergrowth. The trees were 50 meters from the outer fence. Between the fence and the trees lay open ground that was cleared and raked every morning. Any footprints would be immediately visible. The forest represented freedom. The forest was also completely inaccessible. Pemberton knew this. Every prisoner knew this. But he stood and looked anyway. At 1605 hours, Pemberton turned and walked back toward his barack. Hartmann noted the time in his mental log. Everything normal. Everything proceeding according to schedule. The sun was setting early at this latitude, this time of year. Long shadows stretched across the compound. The temperature was dropping. By nightfall it would reach -10 degrees. Hartmann's shift would end at 1800 hours. Then he would climb down from the tower, sign the watch log, walk to the guards' barracks, eat the evening meal, write a letter to his mother in Leipzig, and sleep until 0200 when his next shift began. He did this every day. The war continued somewhere beyond these fences, but inside them, everything remained frozen in routine. Nothing was going to change. Nothing ever changed. January 14, 1944. The morning mail distribution arrived at 0900 hours. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning one letter, its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. His mother's handwriting on the envelope. 37 men and women huddled over while sitting at a table in the guards' mess hall, their breath forming small clouds. 3 other guards were present, eating breakfast and reading newspapers. The temperature hovers just above freezing, but no one complains. The smell of Ersatz coffee mixed with cigarette before them. The letter was 6 pages on a table near the window. His mother wrote about daily life in Leipzig. Simple. A wooden box containing a typewriter had become more severe. 3 rotating wheels, ration and a lamp provided 200 grams of bread per day. When a German operator types a message, 200 grams of potatoes through the machine's complex internal wire. The municipal gardens had been converted to vegetable production, and the encrypted letter lights up. Everyone was required to contribute labor hours. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The letter and planting might become T. She was 61 years old. K. In consecutive uses. The work exhausted her. The pattern never repeats. The bombing raids had increased in frequency. The German military considers American B-17s came during daylight. They have mathematical British Lancasters came at night. The machine's air raid sirens can be arranged in 6 different orders. Everyone went to the shelters. 26 possible starting positions. Sometimes the bombs fell in their district. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs. Last week, encryption. A bomb destroyed the apartment building where the Schneider family exceeds 158 million combinations. 7 injured. To test every possibility, his mother had known Frau Schneider since the earth formed. They had attended the same school. British intelligence has concluded that breaking Schneider was sleeping in the basement of a damaged church with 2 young children and nowhere to go. Every German military communication the letter flows through these 3 more pages. U-boat his mother asked about his health. To coordinate wolf pack attacks. She asked if he was staying warm. She mentioned that his father's pension had been battle plans. She mentioned that cold deliveries were to direct bomber formations over British cities. She mentioned that she prayed for the war to end. Without reading these messages, then she wrote something that made Hartmann stop reading. With them, the war might be Thomas is dead. 2 men was killed side by side during the Allied in the corner of Hut 6. We received the notification last week. Cambridge, where they studied mathematics destroyed, competed for the same academic prizes and does not spend long evenings arguing about Thomas was 19 years old while drinking cheap tea. He had been in the Wehrmacht for 8 months. Now they're both never wanted to be recruited by the government code and cipher school. He wanted to study engineering, working 16-hour shifts trying to find buried in some cemetery I will never see. Lieutenant William folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. He's 31 years old. He sat at the table with wire-rimmed glasses that the other guards slide down his nose. And reading. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath. He thought about Thomas, his fingers moving across the papers together as conducting an invisible orchestra. Thomas was 3 years younger. Before the war, he was completing his doctorate like mathematics and writing a mechanical prime number distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. They had built a model railway together in Thomas's Royal Air Force. They spent an entire summer constructing the layout, with painting miniature rumpled appearance of someone landscapes bothered with superficial concerns. Thomas had been meticulous with details during the opening months of the war until every building had to be painted with a damaged left leg and a permanent limb. Every tree had to be positioned realistically. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying. Now Thomas was dead somewhere in Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns. Boys who were now locked behind the wire that they make an odd pair. Men who had flown bombers over Leipzig, building careful logical frameworks. Men who had dropped explosives on the apartment building where Frau Schneider lived. Fletcher is intuitive. Men who had killed German civilians while sitting safely in the sky. Often prove correct. Hartmann stood up from the table, challenging each other's reasoning, into the but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else. The sky was gray with low clouds. Section. Snow was falling lightly. When one gets stuck on a problem, the other knows exactly which question beginning in the north to break the deadlock. Prisoners forming ranks. Like every morning for the past 3 months, counting. They're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. He messages hours and the wire and the 15 to 30 characters. This camp held 1,200 men who were trying to kill German status and convoy men who would return to their aircraft. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator. Men who would bomb Leipzig again operator would drop more explosives on apartment buildings, would kill more civilians like Frau Schneider. The British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. The routine pushes his glasses up for the 14th time. Everything in an hour because everyone followed against a particularly troubling sequence. But Thomas was dead anyway. Look at this pattern. The rules had not saved messages from different U-boats. The routine had not been 20 minutes. He had done what he was told and it had gotten him killed. The 19 years old in a similar letter for reasons Hartmann did not fully understand. Fletcher leans over. He finished reading the letter that night in his bunk. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. I do not know what this war is for too long. Your father says we are defending Germany format. But Germany is being destroyed while we defend it. Every day there is less food, less coal, less hope. The radio says we are winning. But if we are winning, why does everything keep getting worse? Hartmann folded the letter and put it in his footlocker. He lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. Other guards were sleeping. Someone was snoring. Outside, the December wind rattled the barracks windows. The war continued. The routine continued. Thomas was dead and nothing had changed. January 14, 1944. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. Hartmann was performing his observation pattern in Tower 7. Its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. East wall 30 seconds. Inside hut 6. Compound 37 men and women huddle over wooden tables covered in paper, 30 seconds. Their breath forming small clouds West in the unheated 30 seconds. The temperature hovers just above freezing, approximately 180 times since beginning his shift at 1,000 on the impossible task before them. Everything appeared normal. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window between barracks. It looks deceptively simple. Some were exercising in a wooden box containing a typewriter-like keyboard. Others stood in 3 rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates behavior. When a German operator types a message, electrical current flows through the machine's complex internal wire. Hartmann noticed the rotors turn in specific sequences. 3 prisoners were gathered near the northeast corner of barracks 14. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Prisoners frequently gathered in small groups. Might become T, but these 3 men were standing in a specific formation. 2 were positioned to block sight lines from Tower 6 and Tower 8. The German military considers Enigma unbreakable. The 3rd was crouched low, apparently doing something at ground confidence. Hartmann watched for 30 seconds. Can be arranged in 6 different orders. The crouched man appeared to be working on something beneath the wooden steps leading into the barrack positions. His hands moved rapidly. At the front adds 10 additional wire standing men were not letter pairs before encryption. They were watching. The total number of possible settings exceeds 158. The other million combinations. Neither to test every possibility would require more time. This was the blind spot in the observation pattern. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just a small area near barracks 14 where overlapping sight lines. Every German military communication flows through these machines. Someone who understood the geometry could work in that commanders use Enigma to coordinate Wolfpack attacks on Atlantic convoys. The prisoner finished whatever he was doing. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit battle plans. All 3 men separated and walked in different directions. Controllers use it to direct bomber formations over lasted approximately 45 seconds. Without reading these messages, Hartmann made a note in his watch log. 1,500 the war might be survivable. 3 prisoners near barracks 14. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of hut activity. Continued observation required, where they studied mathematics together. This was proper procedure. Competed for the same academic prizes. Guards were instructed to spend long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea in false alarms created complacency. Now they're both real security threats by the government documented patterns of evidence working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random noise. If the behavior repeated, he would report it to the compound officer. 31 years old, the behavior repeated with 2 hours glasses that constantly slide down his nose. At 1,710 hours, he has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works. His fingers moving across the papers as if positions blocking sight lines. Before the crouched man worked at ground level for approximately 1 minute, writing a thesis on prime number distribution that his advisors considered. Hartmann made another note in his log. Captain James Fletcher, pattern continued over the next 3 days. 29. broad-shouldered and athletic, 3 instances of the same behavior someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns, and 1,650 hours. He flew Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and 1,530 hours. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying, for instance, Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing 1,720 hours. They make an odd each time, the same 3 prisoners. Thornton is methodical, building careful logical the same location, advancing step by systematic step, working at ground level near the barracks is intuitive, leaping to conclusions that seem to observations and often prove correct. They argue constantly, challenging each other's reasoning, security but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. He was 38 years old, problem, the other knows exactly which question to ask. He had been responsible for compound security since this morning, like every morning for the past 3 months. Slowly. They're studying yesterday's intercepted observation naval transmissions. Hartmann. The messages are short, tomorrow morning during roll call when the barracks are empty, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, we will find it. Fuel status, the next morning sighting, December 24th. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operators how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. They searched the area near the northeast corner. Without knowing these settings, the British lifted the meaningless strings of letters. Beneath it, they found a pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. The tunnel was 30 centimeters in diameter, descending vertically 3 messages from different U-boats, turning all sent within 20 minutes. The tunnel walls were reinforced with beds don't match, but the encrypted ventilation was provided by a makeshift pipe constructed from tin cans. Fletcher leans over. The entrance was hidden beneath floorboards that could be quickly replaced. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward the tunnel excavated. It stiffens when he sits too long. Security personnel crawled through. They're using a standardized weather report format. The tunnel extended northeast same from Barracks 14, different data, heading toward the outer fence. If we had enough samples, it was approximately 110 meters long. It had been under construction for 14 months. It was 3 meters deep at its maximum depth, passing beneath both wire fences. It terminated in the forest beyond the cleared perimeter zone. The tunnel was complete. It was operational. It had been ready for use for approximately 3 weeks. But nobody had used it yet. The prisoners had been waiting for something. Proper weather conditions perhaps. Or the right moment in the guard rotation schedule. Or some other factor that Hartmann did not understand. Becker stood at the tunnel entrance looking at the excavated shaft. Other officers gathered around him. Major Meyer arrived and inspected the work. The tunnel was sophisticated. Professional. It showed extensive planning and remarkable engineering. Someone with technical knowledge had designed this. Someone with organizational ability had coordinated the construction. Someone with patience had executed it over 14 months while guards watched and counted and followed their observation patterns. Meyer turned to Becker. How was this discovered? Becker indicated Hartmann, who stood nearby. Unteroffizier Hartmann observed irregular prisoner behavior and filed proper reports. His documentation allowed us to identify the location. Meyer looked at Hartmann. Good work. You may have prevented a mass escape. Hartmann said nothing. He thought about the tunnel. 14 months of digging. Hundreds of hours of labor. Coordinated by men who were supposed to be defeated and contained. Men who looked small and cold during roll call. Men who were apparently capable of extraordinary things when nobody was watching carefully enough. The tunnel was filled with concrete that afternoon. The prisoners responsible for its construction were identified through interrogation. They were transferred to different camps. Security procedures were reviewed and modified. Guard observation patterns were changed. Additional patrols were implemented. The routine was adjusted to prevent similar incidents. Everything returned to normal. Except Hartmann kept thinking about the tunnel. About men working in darkness for 14 months. About planning that required intelligence and patience and belief that escape was possible even when everyone said it was not. About people who refused to accept that nothing would change. January 27, 1944. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. Hartmann was off duty, sitting in the Victorian mess hall writing a response to his mother's letter. Its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. Soviet forces were advancing in Poland. 37 men and women forces were engaged in heavy fighting in Belgium, their breath forming small clouds called the Battle of the Bulge. The temperature situation was described as, but no one but under control. Their two focused on the impossible task but under control, meant bad the Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. The newsreader's voice maintains steady confidence. A wooden box containing a typewriter being spoken suggested that Germany was losing ground on a lampboard that illuminates letters. One of the other guards, when a German operator types a message, sat down across flows through the machine's complex internal wiring. 41, the veteran who had served in Poland and France before encrypted letter lights up on the board. Duty after taking shrapnel. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Coffee from a tin cup and lit a cigarette. Might become T. They are evacuating camps in the east, in consecutive without preamble. The pattern never getting too close. The German military is moving prisoners west before they can be liberated. They have mathematical reason looked up from his letter. The machine's 3 rotors can be arranged anywhere in 6 different orders. Camps inside Germany has 26 possible starting positions that need labor. A plugboard prisoners are just being marched into wire connections that swap letter pairs. They walk until they reach another camp or until they die of possible settings exceeds 158 million combinations. Not yet. To test every possibility would require more time than this camp is only 28 kilometers from Poland. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking advancing isn't just important. They will reach this area in 3 to 4 weeks. Every German military command will not leave 1,200 British and American prisoners to be liberated by communists to coordinate wolf pack attacks on Atlantic convoys. Bad for morale. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit battle plans. Stalag Luft III use it to direct bomber formations. 1,200 men marched west in winter conditions. Without reading these messages, some would not survive. Blind. The old ones. With them, the war might be survivable. The sick ones. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner. Men would die on the roads because the army needed to move them somewhere else to prevent them. Where they studied mathematics together, competed for the same academic prizes, and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea. They evacuated 9,000 prisoners last week. Now they're both marched them 60 by the government code and cipher school, working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in prisoners wore wooden clogs and striped uniforms. Lieutenant William Thornton, no Royal clothing, is 31 years old, adequate food, thin and pale with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. Anyone who could not keep up was shot by the muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works, his fingers moving across the paper. This is a prisoner of war invisible orchestra. Geneva Convention applies. He was completing his doctorate at Cambridge, without humor, writing a thesis on prime number distribution applies until it does considered groundbreaking. When the Russians are 20 kilometers away and command Royal Air Force empty this camp in 48 hours, broad-shouldered, do you think they will be concerned about the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered men on trains or march them west? And they will do it as efficiently as possible during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limb. Returned to his letter. The Air Ministry deemed him focus on combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree every afternoon looking at the forest, seeing patterns others miss. He thought about prisoners in barracks 14 digging a tunnel for 14 months. Thornton is methodical. He thought about men planning escapes because staying in the camp was safer than accepting what might come next. Fletcher is intuitive. That night, leaping to conclusions that seem to come from nowhere, but he lay in his bunk listening to other guards breathing and constantly, challenging each other's reasoning. He thought about his cousin Thomas, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. He thought about Frau Schneider sleeping in a church basement with 2 children. The other knows exactly which question to ask. He thought about his mother writing that she did not know what the war was for anymore. Like every morning for the past 3 months, they're studying yesterday's who would be German naval Soviets advanced. The messages are short, men dying typically on 15 because that was easier than allowing by U-boat commanders reporting their positions. The rules said fuel status must be contained and convoy sightings. The rules said security must be maintained with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator must be set up their Enigma machine for decryption. But Thomas had followed the rules without knowing these settings. Frau Schneider had followed the rules and lost her home. His mother was following the rules for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly important surviving them. Look at this pattern. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes. The indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle, it stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. Same structure, different data. If we had enough samples. January 27, 1945. Bletchley Park, 1,430 hours. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog. The evacuation order had come 3 days early through the mist that rolls across the frozen forces were 12 kilometers from the inside Hut 6. Stalag Luft III would be emptied starting January covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds. The prisoners would be marched west to other camps deeper in Germany. The temperature hovers just above freezing. Groups of no one could land at intervals of 2 hours. They're too focused on the impossible task. Evacuation would take 2 days. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the windows on evacuation security protocols. It looks deceptively simple. A wooden box containing a typewriter of guards on both sides, 3 rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates letters would be shot. When a German operator could not maintain pace would be left for the rear guard to handle. Machine's complex internal wiring. Rear guard meant SS personnel following behind the main column, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Rear guard meant death. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Temperature was minus 18 degrees Celsius, then K. Snow was falling continuously. The wind speed was 40 kilometers per hour. The German military considers Enigma 75 kilometers through open countryside. They have mathematical reason for trains would transport prisoners further west. The machine's 3 rotors can be arranged. March duration was estimated at 36 to 48 hours depending on conditions and prisoner fitness. A medical staff reviewed the prisoner additional wire connections that swapped letter pairs. 180 prisoners had medical conditions. The total number of possible winter marching dangerous 158 million pneumonia, tuberculosis, to test every possibility would require more time than injuries that had not healed properly. Yet British intelligence still be required that breaking Enigma isn't just important. Medical exemptions were not being granted. Every German military communication dies here when the Soviets arrive. U-boat commanders used Enigma to coordinate Wolfpack attacks on Atlantic Tower 7 for the final day before evacuation. Generals use it to transmit battle plans. 1,200 to 1,000 controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British preparing for departure. Without reading these messages, they wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they owned. With them, they packed small bags with whatever possessions they could carry. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner that would probably never be delivered. They'd been friends since Cambridge, where they studied mathematics together, in silence, competed for the same academic prizes, what was coming, and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea. Maybe kill the strong ones too. Now they're both 1,400 by the government code and Cypher saw squadron working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random location as always. Lieutenant William Thornton beyond the wire was white with snow. 31 years old. The trees were dark against the wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down through the branches. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath every afternoon for the 16 months moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. But today was different. Before the war, Pemberton was not just looking his doctorate at Cambridge. He was writing a thesis on prime number distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. Hartmann understood James Fletcher, Royal Air Force. Pemberton was not planning escape from broad-shouldered and athletic. He was planning survival during the evacuation. Someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. Separate from the march column during the chaos of fires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. Might reach the Allied Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns and walked back toward his barrack. They make an odd pair. Hartmann noted the time. Thornton is methodical, everything normal, building careful logical everything according to routine, advancing step by systematic step. Except Hartmann thought about Thomas. Fletcher is intuitive, 19 years old, that seem to come from nowhere but often prove correct. Never wanted to be a soldier. They argue constantly, challenging each other's study engineering, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else. 75 kilometers and minus 18 degree weather. When one gets stuck on a problem, thought about men dying by the roadside, which question to ask to break the deadlock. Thought about SS rear guard. This morning, like thought about survival versus months. They're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. 3 prisoners approached the warning wire near the blind spot between Tower 6 and 8, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, fuel status, they were the tunnel diggers from Barracks 14. Each message begins with a three-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their represented 14 months of hope. Without the 3 men were not planning to escape right now. Are meaningless strings of letters. Not in daylight. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Calculating the possibilities. 3 messages from during the evacuation all sent within 20 minutes. When guards were tired and cold, the indicator groups don't match. When columns were strung out over similar letter frequency distributions. When chaos made observation leans over, studying the papers. Hartmann watched them for 30 seconds. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an observation window. It stiffens when he 30 seconds on each sector. They're using a standardized weather report format. East wall. Same structure. Compound in different data. South if we wall. Had enough samples. West wall. The cycle repeated every 2.5 minutes. The men would be visible from Tower 7 for approximately 45 more seconds before moving out of his line of sight. If he maintained standard procedure, he would observe them for 30 seconds, then shift to the south wall for the next 30 seconds. During those 30 seconds on the south wall, the men would move. By the time he returned to this observation angle, they would be gone. Everything would appear normal. If he deviated from pattern and continued watching them, he would see whatever they were doing. He would be required to report it. They would be identified and placed under additional security. During the evacuation march, they would be watched more carefully. Their chance of survival would decrease. Standard procedure said continue the observation pattern. Report any irregularities. Maintain security protocols. Follow the rules. Hartmann thought about his mother's letter. I do not know what this war is for anymore. He thought about Thomas. Dead for reasons nobody could adequately explain. He thought about Frau Schneider sleeping in a church basement with 2 children. He thought about prisoners being marched into winter until they died. The 3 men were still visible. Still measuring. Still hoping. Hartmann turned his attention to the south wall. Standard observation pattern. 30 seconds. By the time he returned to the compound interior view, the 3 men had separated and walked away. Nothing unusual. Everything normal. He had followed procedure perfectly. Except he had turned 30 seconds early. He had not completed his compound interior observation window. He had looked away while there was still time to see. It was a small deviation. Meaningless in the larger pattern of security procedures. Nobody would notice. Nobody would question. The war would continue. The evacuation would proceed. Men would die on winter roads regardless of what happened in Watchtower 7 on January 27 at 1505 hours. But Hartmann had made a choice. For the first time in his life, he had chosen to not see something he was supposed to see. January 28, 1945. Bletchley Park, 600 hours, England. The evacuation began. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog. The first column of 200 prisoners assembled in the compound yard. The mist that rolls across the frozen ground. They formed ranks in the darkness. Inside hut 6, guards took positions along both sides of the formation. Wooden tables covered in paper. Major Meyer gave final small clouds in the unheated room. The march would proceed at a pace of 5 just above freezing per hour, but no one complained. Prisoners would be allowed one 10-minute rest stop every 2 hours before them. Any prisoner who could not maintain on a table would fall out and wait for the rear guard. It looks deceptively simple. Any prisoner who attempted to escape would be shot. Typewriter-like keyboard, the compound rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates letters. Prisoners walked in groups of 4, carrying small packs with their possessions. Machine's complex internal wiring. They wore whatever clothing they had in specific sequences. Some had proper winter lights up on the board. Others had blankets wrapped around their shoulders. No resemblance to the original text. Guards wore standard Wehrmacht winter uniforms with heavy coats and boots. Then F. They were prepared for the weather. Consecutive uses. The prisoners were not. The pattern never repeats. Hartmann marched with the second column, military which departed at 0800 hours. They have mathematical reason for was in this group. The machines with the 3 tunnels can be arranged in 6 different orders. Hartmann saw them in formation but did not acknowledge starting positions. He took his position on the right flank of the column, 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. The march route led northwest from the camp. The total number of possible settings exceeds 158 million combinations. Wind blew from the east. To test every possibility would require more time than has passed since the visibility was limited by falling snow. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just 200 meters. It's existential. Guards maintain spacing along the military communication flows through these machines, but not crowded. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate Wolfpack attacks on Atlantic convoys. He was from the middle of the column. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit 38 years old, who had been in the camp for 2 years. Controllers use it to direct bomber formations pneumonia in December. He fell forward into the snow and did not get fights blind. 2 prisoners tried to help him stand. The war might be survivable. Guards ordered them to continue marching side by side at a table in the corner was left lying in the snow. They'd been friends since Cambridge, would find him, where they studied mathematics together. Guard was 3 hours the same academic prizes, after 2 long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. Prisoners sat in the snow or stood hunched against by the government code and cipher. Some shared food from 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in others drank melted snow. Guards maintained perimeter security but allowed prisoners to rest without formation, thin and pale with wire-rimmed glasses that everyone stood and continued marching. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works. A sergeant, his fingers moving across the paper, had severe frostbite on both feet from a previous exposure incident. Before the war, he was completing his doctorate at Cambridge, writing a thesis on by the roadside distribution that his advisors told him to stand. He shook his head. Fletcher, Royal Air Force, is 29. Guards moved the column forward and athletic, with the perpetually rumpled watching them disappear into the snow with superficial concerns. By kilometer 25, he flew 15 prisoners during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. Some the Air Ministry that had been manageable in the camp but became fatal during continuous winter discovering his undergraduate mathematics saw them by the roadside as the column patterns others missed. Men sitting in snow. They make an odd pair. Some were conscious. Thornton is methodical. Some were not. Careful logical frameworks. The rear guard was behind them somewhere in the white distance. Fletcher is intuitive, leaping to conclusions that seem to come from nowhere but often prove correct. The road narrowed. They argued constantly, close on both sides, each other's reasoning. Visibility also understand each other's minds better than anyone else by the forest canopy, but snow continued falling. When one gets stuck on a problem, the column spacing increased as prisoners struggled to maintain pace on the narrow road. This morning, guards tried to keep everyone visible, 3 months, but in the forest darkness and falling snow, German observation became difficult. The messages are short. Was marching on the right flank, maintaining position 20 meters behind commanders reporting their positions. He watched the column ahead of convoy sightings. He watched the forest. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their escape machine for decryption. At 1,430 hours, the British intercepts meaningless strings of letters. Hartmann's attention was drawn to a commotion pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Trying to revive him. Look at this pattern. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes to assess the situation. The indicator groups don't match, approximately but 2 minutes, everyone's attention was focused on the front of the formation. Fletcher leans over, studying them separated from the middle of the column. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. Saw them disappear into the trees. Too long. The tunnel diggers from standardized weather report format. The same men he had watched measuring distances at the warning wire. If we had enough samples. The same men he had looked away from at 1,505 hours on January 27. Standard procedure was to sound alarm immediately. Fire warning shots. Alert other guards. Organize pursuit. Hartmann turned to signal the guard nearest to him. He raised his hand. The other guard looked at him expectantly. Hartmann lowered his hand. He pointed toward the front of the column where the collapsed prisoner was being attended. The other guard nodded and turned back to watching the column. The prisoner at the front was revived enough to continue with assistance. The column resumed marching. 3 men were missing from the formation. Nobody else had noticed their absence yet. When the next formal count happened at the rest stop in 2 hours, the discrepancy would be discovered. But by then the missing prisoners would be hours deep into the forest. Pursuit would be difficult. Recovery would be unlikely. The forest stretched for kilometers in all directions. Hartmann continued marching. He watched the column. He watched the forest. He saw nothing unusual. Everything was proceeding according to plan. January 29, 1945. Bletchley 0200 hours, England. The column reached the Victorian complex used as a temporary shelter. Its brick facade prisoners were allowed to rest inside the barns for 4 hours. Guards conducted a formal roll call. 37 men and women huddled over wooden tables. 8 prisoners were missing, their breath forming small clouds had fallen out during the march and were presumed to be the temperature hovers just above freezing. 5 were unaccounted for. Their 2 focused on the impossible task before them. Oberleutnant Becker organized an investigation. Sits on a table near the window. He questioned guards about when and where prisoners might have separated. A wooden box containing a typewriter-like keyboard was among those 3 rotating wheels, and he reported observing nothing irregular. When a German operator types a message, to monitor due to visibility the machine's complex internal wiring, men could have separated during any of several occasions when the column stopped letter lights up on the board. Becker was frustrated that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Evacuation marches always resulted in escapes. Then prisoners understood that death on the road was certain. Escape into the forest offered a chance, however the German military considered some would try unbreakable. Some would probably have mathematical reasons for confidence. A few might reach the machine's partisan groups. Rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. That was acceptable loss compared to total disaster if the Soviets liberated the camp with prisoners still inside. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. No definitive answers emerged. The total number of possible settings the missing prisoners were logged as escape million combinations. Their descriptions were reported to local security authorities. Possibility would require more time. Search parties were dispatched but had minimal chance of success. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking an escape isn't just several hours head start. It's existential. At 0600 German military communication flows through these machines. The column had been reduced by the commanders used Enigma to coordinate wolf pack attacks on approximately 175 prisoners. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit battle plans. Worse than they had at the beginning. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. More resigned to whatever would happen next. Britain fights blind. Guards looked similar. With them, everyone might be survivable. Everyone wanted to march side by side at a table in the corner. The second day was harder than the first. They'd been friends since Cambridge, prisoners collapsed. Where they studied mathematics together. More fell out. Competed for the same academic kilometer 50 and spent 20 additional prisoners arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. The column numbered only 140 men. Now they're both here, recruited by the government strongest cipher school, working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random noise. But even they were failing. Lieutenant William 72, Royal Navy, kilometers from is 31 years old. Squadron leader Pemberton pale with wire-rimmed glasses. Hartmann was walking past him when it happened. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath. He stood still for a moment, his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. His eyes were open but vacant. He was completing his doctorate at Extreme exhaustion, writing a thesis on prime number distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. Two prisoners tried to help him stand. Royal Air Force. Pemberton did not respond. Broad-shouldered and he sat in the snow looking at perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who told the prisoners to continue marching. The prisoners hesitated. Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg, looking back at Pemberton sitting alone by the roadside. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree. Other guards maintained their positions along the formation. They Hartmann stood 10 meters from Pemberton. Thornton is methodical, building standard procedure was to leave fallen prisoners step by systematic step. Keep the column moving. Fletcher is intuitive, maintain conclusions that seem to come from nowhere. Do not stop for individuals. The march had to continue, challenging each other's reasoning, was 3 but kilometers they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. The mission was to deliver surviving prisoners to the trains. The other knows exactly everything else was secondary to break the deadlock. Hartmann thought about this morning standing every morning for the past 3 months for 16 months. Yesterday's intercepted German naval looking at the forest. The messages are short, calculating distances and possibility characters, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their tunnel digging and fuel status, and convoy sightings. A man who refused to accept each message begins with a 3-letter logical that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. He crouched beside without knowing these settings. Pemberton's British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Recognition was delayed. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Stand up. Look at this pattern. Repeated. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 kilometers. The indicator group shook his head slightly, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Why? Fletcher leans over. Hartmann did not have an answer that made sense. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. Germany was being destroyed when he sits too long. Thomas was dead. They're using a standardized weather report was homeless. His mother was starving. Different data. The prisoners were being marched to death. Nothing made sense. But 3 kilometers was 3 kilometers. A man could walk 3 kilometers if he chose to. Stand up, Hartmann said again. He pulled Pemberton to his feet. Pemberton's legs barely supported him. Hartmann put Pemberton's arm over his shoulder and took most of his weight. They began walking. 3 kilometers. 1 step at a time. The column was far ahead. Other guards had not noticed Hartmann's absence. The march continued. Hartmann walked with Pemberton, supporting his weight, maintaining forward movement. Pemberton said nothing. Hartmann said nothing. They walked through the snow while wind blew from the east and the war continued somewhere in the distance. They reached Spremberg at 1800 hours. The train was waiting. The surviving prisoners were loaded into freight cars. 142 men from the original 200 in the second column. 58 had died or been left during the march. The train would transport them to another camp. Another compound. Another wire fence. But they were alive. Pemberton was loaded with the others. He looked at Hartmann before entering the freight car. No words were exchanged. Hartmann did not know what to say. Pemberton nodded once. Then he was gone into the darkness of the train car. January 14, 1945. 2 months after the evacuation march, England. Soviet forces had captured the entire morning fog. Its brick facade barely visible was empty and abandoned across the frozen ground. The prisoners had been dispersed to camps throughout Germany. 37 men and women survived until wooden tables covered in paper. Their breath did not. Small clouds in the Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. The temperature hovers just above freezing. The war was ending, but no one complains. Everyone knew it would end. They're too focused on the impossible task before Germany would lose. The Enigma machine had been transferred west with other guards. It looks deceptively simple. He was assigned to camp administrative duty in Bavaria, far from any combat zones. 3 rotating wheels, then a lamp board that illuminated from combat service was now keeping him from the final desperate fighting. Electrical current flows through the machine's complex internal wire supplies and waiting for whatever came next. And the encrypted letter lights up on the board. He received a letter forwarded. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. No return address. The letter postmark becomes T, then F. He opened it carefully in consecutive uses. Inside was a single page written never repeats. He could read English adequately. Considers Enigma unbreakable. The Wehrmacht had required guards. They have mathematical reasons to have basic language skills. The letter orders can be arranged in 6 different to the guard in Tower 7. Each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. We reached partisan contacts after 6 days. Adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before crossed into Czechoslovakia. The total number of eventually reached Switzerland 158 million combinations. We are safe. To test every possibility will require more time than has passed since we wanted you to know that your 30 seconds changed everything. British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just important. It's existential. We do not know why you gave us that chance. Every German military communication flows because these machines. Thank you. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate wolf pack attacks on Atlantic convoys. The letter was anonymous because any connection between escaped prisoners and a German guard would be dangerous. Controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British who had written it. Without the tunnel diggers from Barracks 14, Britain fights blind. The 3 men who disappeared into the forest on January 28 at kilometer 38 side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. Hartmann folded the letter and placed it in his footlocker beneath his mother's mathematics together. Thomas competed for the same academic prizes, thinking about spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking 5 hours on January 27 in Watchtower 7. Now they're both here. The moment when he turned government code and looked away while men measured possibilities at the warning wire, trying to find patterns in seemingly random noise. He had not made a conscious decision. Lieutenant William Thornton, and did not want to admit it, is 31 years old. The war had taken his cousin, pale with wire-rimmed glasses, had destroyed Frau Schneider's down his nose, had starved his mother. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath in cities across Germany, his fingers moving across the papers, had sent prisoners on death marches, orchestra, had made everything worse while claiming to defend his doctorate at Cambridge. The rules had not saved any number distribution that his advisors considered not protected anyone. Captain James Fletcher had simply made him complicit in atrocity. 29. Broad-shouldered, so he had looked away for 30 seconds, with the perpetually rumpled appearance of not as an act of rebellion with superficial concerns, not as a moral statement. He flew Spitfires simply as a moment of choosing not to see something that would require him to do something he did not want to do. A permanent limp. A small deviation from routine deemed him unfit for combat, meaningless in the context of the war. After discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree, who are now alive in Switzerland instead of dead in the forest or on the road. They make an odd pair. Hartmann did not know if he had done the right thing. Building careful logical frameworks become complicated during the war by systematic step. Everyone claimed to be Fletcher is intuitive. Everyone had justifications and explanations and necessary reasons for terrible actions. They argue constantly. The Wehrmacht was defending each other's reasoning, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else. Prisoners needed to be contained. When one gets stuck on a problem, the other knows exactly which question to ask to break the deadlock. Or they had to be broken. This morning, everything depended on the perspective and timing. Their studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. 3 men were alive. The messages are short. That was a fact independent of ideology or justification. Sent by U-boat commanders. They were alive because a guard looked away for 30 seconds. And convoy sightings. Because someone chose not to see something with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up had momentarily mattered more than systematic routine. Without knowing these settings, the war ended. The British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Hartmann was captured by American forces in glasses up for the 14th time. He spent 2 years in a prisoner camp against a particularly troubling sequence. The irony was not lost on him. Look at this pattern. He experienced what the messages from different U-boats had all sent within 20 minutes. Wire fences. The indicator groups don't match, calls, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Rules that controlled everything. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. He was released and is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. He returned to Leipzig, which was now in the Soviet occupation zone. They're using a standardized weather report. The city had been bombed into rubble. Same structure. His mother had died during the final months of the war. If we had enough samples. Frau Schneider and her children were gone, presumably dead or relocated. The apartment building where he had grown up was a pile of broken concrete and twisted metal. Everything familiar was destroyed. He found work in a factory. Later he became a supervisor. He married in 1951. Had 2 children. Lived a quiet life in the German Democratic Republic. He never spoke about the war. Never told his family about Stalag Luft III. Never mentioned the letter from Switzerland. Nobody asked. Everyone had their own war stories. Everyone wanted to forget. In 1962, 17 years after the war ended, Hartmann received another letter. This one had a proper return address in England. It was from Roger Pemberton. Squadron leader. Royal Air Force. Retired. Pemberton wrote that he had spent considerable effort tracking down guards from the evacuation march. He wanted to thank the guard who had helped him walk the final 3 kilometers to Spremberg. He wanted to acknowledge that a German soldier had saved his life when he could have left him to die. Hartmann wrote back. They corresponded occasionally over the following years. Brief letters. Updates on families and health. Neither discussed the war in detail. Neither attempted to analyze what had happened or why. They simply acknowledged that they had been present in the same terrible moment, and one had helped the other survive, and that was enough. January died in 1940. His daughter sent Hartmann a letter informing him of the death. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in father in his RAF uniform barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. Young and confident before captivity had aged inside hut 6, before the war men and women huddled over wooden tables covered in paper. Hartmann placed their photograph in his footlocker next to the two letters. The letter from his mother just above freezing, the letter no one complains. Now the photograph on the impossible task before them. Small pieces of a war that had consumed millions of lives and destroyed everything he knew. It looks deceptively simple. He died in 1983 at the age of 60-like keyboard. Three rotating complications and a chronic board that illuminates perhaps related to that January-March when a German operator types a message, electrical current flows through the machine's complex internal wire and the accumulated damage of living through years when everyone was cold and hungry and dying. His children that found the letters bears no resemblance to the original apartment. The letter did not understand their significance. Then F. They asked their mother if she knew anything about a prisoner of war camp or a British officer. Repeats. She did not. The German military considers their father had never mentioned any of it. They have mathematical reason. So they filed the items with his other papers and moved on with their lives. The machine's 3 rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. The tunnel at Stalag Luft III remained filled with concrete until the next possible starting positions. When Polish authorities excavated the site, the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs. The tunnel from Bearings 14 was documented and preserved. The total number of possible settings. A small museum was established. Million visitors could see where prisoners had dug toward every possibility would require more time than has passed since the earth had ultimately escaped during a winter evacuation. British intelligence has concluded that breaking in the guard in Tower 7 had looked away at the right moment. Every German military communication flows through these machines. Nobody can identify him. U-boat commanders used had been destroyed or lost. Wolf pack attacks on Atlantic witnesses were dead or scattered. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit battle plans, rumors and unverified accounts. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. A guard may have facilitated. Without reading these messages, the details were unclear. History moved on. The war might be survived. But in March 1945, 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of hut guard for 30 seconds that changed everything. They've been friends since Cambridge, and they studied mathematics together. That small deviation from the same academic prizes. That moment of choosing not to see something arguing about number theory and logic the difference between death and drafty college rooms. Between completing the mission and showing mercy, recruited by the government code between following rules and working 16-hour shifts trying to find destroyed cities and killed millions and reshaped the world. Lieutenant William Thornton, but in one small moment, in one 31 years old, one guard made one choice with wire-rimmed glasses and 3 men slide down his nose. And one prisoner he has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath. Years later, letters were exchanged moving across the enemy lines as if conducting an invisible orchestra. And perhaps that was all anyone could do. Before the war, he was completing his doctorate of humanity inside the machinery of destruction. Prime number distribution that 30 seconds that nobody else would remember or record or honor. Captain James Fletcher, but Royal Air Force that mattered is 29 to the people they saved and athletic. The forest still stands near the site of Stalag Luft III with superficial concerns. The trees that provided cover for escaping prisoners during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. The wind still blows from the east. Deemed him unfit for combat flying and somewhere in the darkness between Tower 7 and undergraduate mathematics degree, a moment exists frozen in time, seeing patterns others miss. A guard turning away. They make an odd pair. 3 men moving into the trees. Thornton is methodical, a choice made without witnesses or judgment, advancing steps beyond the simple fact of survival. Fletcher is in history does not record the names of guards that seem to come from nowhere but often prove correct. It does not commemorate small mercies or brief deviations challenging each other's reasoning. It remembers they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. But wars are not won or lost in grand campaigns. The other knows exactly which question to ask. They are also won and lost in individual moments when people choose like every morning for the past 3 months. They're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. When they measure their duty against their conscience and decide which matters 15 to 30 characters. Friedrich Hartmann looked away for 40 seconds. Fuel status. That is what happened on January 27, 1945. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine. Everything else, the escape, without knowing these settings, the letters, the British intercepts are followed from that single choice. Thornton pushes his glasses barely registered in the flow of an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling determined who lived and who died. Look at this pattern. The war continued. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes. But for 30 seconds, the indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. It stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. Same structure, different data. If we had enough samples.